Hey everybody, KC here. So, over the years, 20 plus years of doing morning newsbeat, I've talked a lot about data analytics, usually expressing a certain amount of skepticism that retailers are not using data analytics, not using the data that they have to maximum possible effect. I've often said that, the key to really making it work is to have not just having actionable data, but to actually acting on that data. And, we've had conversations about that over the years, but I wanted to talk to somebody I've gotten to know a little bit. His name is Tom Fuyala, and Tom is the CEO of 11 Ants Analytics Group out of Auckland, New Zealand, which is where he's coming to us from now. And they're in the analytics business. And I didn't want to so much in this case talk from a 30,000 foot view of analytics, but we are talking from 8,500 miles away, right? So I wanted to get the perspective from somebody who's not intimately involved in US grocery retailing, although his business is all over the world, and get a sense from him of what he thinks about some of my premises and go from there. So Tom, first of all, welcome to Morning Newsbeat.
Hey, Kevin, thanks very much. No, it's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. So one of the things you say on your website is that using data to connect with shoppers is the key to winning in retail, which sort of sounds like obvious, but not so obvious that every retailer is actually doing that. So, I mean, let's start from how sort of my introduction, which is, would you sort of agree with my premise that while retailers may have data, they're not using it to maximum effect?
No, absolutely, I would. And I think it comes down to there's probably several fathers to that sort of fact. I think, firstly, when you want to use your data to understand the shopper, it actually becomes very, very hard with a lot of the tools that are out there. And this is, I think, sort of, there's a few factors at play here. One is retailers have traditionally been organized around products. So you imagine, department, category, subcategory. And therefore, the information systems also have been developed in that way. And then what that gives rise to is the metrics that retailers have been using since the beginning of time. It's sales, units sold, gross profit. But one thing's clear, those numbers, they definitely don't cut it when you're actually trying to understand the shopper. You need to get to a much deeper level. I think invariably, the time people start thinking about this sort of thing is when they put in place a loyalty program. That's normally some form of loyalty program, some form of identifying the customer. And the big benefit that brings is they can track the customer longitudinally over time. So suddenly they know, is it one customer coming 1,000 times or is it 1,000 customers coming one time? But then when you want to start dealing with the actual data at that point, it just becomes a nightmare. I mean, it becomes a living hell for the people that actually try to do it. And this is why it becomes a difficult thing to do.
Yeah, it's interesting you kind of put it that way because, people talk about category management all the time in the industry, but they don't really talk about, I've never seen you have category managers, but you very rarely see customer managers. And I mean, you talk about loyalty marketing, but most retailers, not all, but most retailers sort of use their loyalty marketing programs as a way of sending out, coupons electronically these days, right? I mean, they're not really rewarding people based on past habits or trying to ingrain new habits or responding to, to behavior that they've exhibited. And most retailers, again, not all, but most retailers, it's funny, you say they don't know if they have 1,000 people coming in once or one person coming in 1,000 times. But in terms of most programs, it doesn't matter. They're all getting exactly the same offers. Now, not everybody. Kroger has done a really good job. I mean, big companies like Kroger do a really good job of drilling down and giving people different offers. I can think of a 3-store retailer like a Dorothy Lane Market that does a really good job of responding specifically to customers. But for the most part, that's not true. And it's fascinating to me. I mean, you talk about, figuring they're able to track transactions, but it seems to me, and again, argue with me if you think I'm wrong, but that the industry actually needs to become less transactional, less focused on the individual transactions and more relational in terms of encouraging long-term relationships. Can data analytics applied a certain way help them make that transition? I mean, if you agree that they need to make that transition.
Well, I'd maybe rephrase it slightly. In principle, what you're saying is correct, but I wouldn't sort of throw out the baby with the bathwater necessarily. So I believe the transactions are a critical part of understanding the relationship. So it's sort of this concept of merging them together, and how do you actually now look at your transactions in the lens of a customer, as opposed to transactions that are sort of these anonymous baskets that are going through.
And to be clear, I'm not saying the transactions aren't important. They obviously
No,
are.
of course.
They're the foundation. But what I mean is retailers who think to themselves, okay, I've got, if I get 20,000 transactions a week and the average transaction is $10, boy, if I could get it up to, if I can get 50 more transactions a week and get the average transaction up to $11, I'm great. And I just think that's the wrong way to approach it.
Well, let's use that example, and it's a very good example. So if we take it back a step, what's the retailer really want to do? Most likely they want to increase their sales for the week, and they want to increase their gross profit, or depending on what the strategy is for that particular retailer. So at the end of it, actually, those two numbers are just symptoms. Well, what really is the decomposition of that? Well, it's how many customers you had in store. It's what percentage of your customers shop various categories. It's when those customers came in, how much did they spend per visit? If you break it down further, how many visits did they have in the period? If you break that even further down, the spend per visit, did they take more units or less units? If you break that further down, were they taking more expensive units or less expensive units? Once you see that side of it, actually you've got a far richer sort of source of data to be making your decisions on, understanding what levers you might be pulling next week to get better effect.
Yeah. Do you find in terms of, and I start out by saying you have customers, clients all over the world. Does the existence of e-commerce and also like in-store technologies, whether it's people using their phones to scan product or whatever it happens to be, first of all, I would imagine that makes it easier to sort of track customers and compile data. But does it tend to create a retailer class that is more responsive to that data?
Look, I think what I'd see that there's different technologies getting sort of that maybe are used in stores, and from what I've seen, a lot of that stuff remains quite siloed. So it's got its own solution, but it's not necessarily well integrated to the whole core transactional customer data set. And that becomes quite a big initiative. Sometimes can be very, very, very difficult for people to do. I think from the e-commerce perspective, yes, certainly having a e-commerce site suddenly means you actually can track the customer, because that the customers identify themselves, and there's a whole lot of metrics that come out that you can do. What I find, our experience anyway, is that probably the center of gravity in most retailers is still the bricks and mortar store, and any good practices that may come out of e-commerce don't necessarily, it seems like the pull is the other way. There's probably less being done on the e-commerce stuff than there could be, rather than more being done on the bricks and mortar stuff. I don't know if that makes sense. I'm saying that the potential of e-commerce to take some of those best practices and apply them in stores is probably not being realized.
Give me an example. Can you?
Yeah, sure. You've got an e-commerce site. You've got richer data available to you pretty much immediately, but you just look at it still in the lens of what you're actually looking at your old stuff.
No, but I mean, how could, in other words, is it just mindset in terms of thinking in terms of being very specific about what customers are buying what, and on e-commerce sites, they know how long they're looking at things, how many times they click through before they buy it. I mean, there's a lot of that information that a sophisticated e-commerce site can glean.
No, absolutely. I think that's a very good question. So I would say mindset as much as just about the critical mass of how an organization thinks. So yeah, I think it is mindset. I think you probably used the right word. This is our mode. We're probably more likely to keep translating things into the way we have done. And certainly as the retailer invests more and more in the e-commerce initiative, then that matures and it becomes more and more evolved. But I don't see that necessarily always transferring back to the bricks and mortar thing. I think that's probably my largest point.
Yeah. Well, and you used the word silos before, and that's always, I mean, I've been writing about this industry for a long time, almost 40 years. And it seems to me that, I can remember, from almost the beginning, long before there was e-commerce and a lot of the technologies that we see today, people would say the biggest problem that retailers have is things are siloed off. Marketing doesn't talk to advertising, or doesn't, and nobody talks to people in charge of customer service. The store development people aren't talking. It's all over the map, and people aren't talking to each other. And I think that has changed maybe a little bit over the years, but not nearly as much as one would think. Is that a fair observation?
Yeah, it is. And I think also it raises an interesting point about sort of relative political strength within the organizations potentially.
Yeah.
So generally the merchandising group, the commercial team will have, that's the sort of the engine of the company just
Right.
about. So a lot of the things that people have, the people that might be most interested in the customer centric type view and the marketing, loyalty and things like that. And certainly they'll have input and impact into that, but often the company will live or die by the performance of the merchandising team. So this sort of becomes a sort of a de facto way decisions are made too. I don't know how you feel about that.
Well, listen, in some ways that there's a metaphor to publishing, which is the business that I've traditionally been in, right? Which is that they view salespeople, right, as being assets because they're generating sales, and they view editorial people as being a cost because they don't go right. As being an editorial person, I've always resented that because if I don't do what I have to do, then the salespeople have nothing to sell. Right. And I think there's probably a fair, I wonder if there's a sort of a similar construct in retailing, right? That the people who there are people viewed as cost. Listen, people who work in stores are very often, employees, frontline employees are viewed as a cost. They're not necessarily viewed as an asset. And very often, and this would take us down a different road, but very often managers from the CEO right down to department managers are being compensated on how low they can get those, right? How low can they get their labor factor, ignoring the fact that they are intrinsic to how successful a store is going to be, right? The category manager who's making the deals with manufacturers, right? Or a sales, a buyer, they're seeing, oh man, look at the great deals they brought in. And yet that may be disconnected in some way, shape or form from the customer experience in the store.
Yeah, very much so. And then retail's that very delicate balance, isn't it? Between, keeping your costs at the level that's viable and still creating a great customer experience. I think one of the, following on from your sort of base question to that, I think one of the things that certainly in my experience would be that just about feels like a change agent needs to come into these organizations to actually sort of flip the switch. That might be at the most senior level, at the CEO level, or it might be at a level that the CEO or the board have decided, look, we really need to get more focused on how do we sort of move this company into a more customer centric, and which means data centric company, and then someone will come in and it's amazing. I've seen this in several retailers where, just for years and years, it's just seemed like, from our own perspective, we're like, that's a lost cause from a data perspective. And then somebody new comes into the organization at a senior, sufficiently senior level of seniority, and 8 weeks later, I'm not saying the whole organization's changed, but the attitude and the openness of the organization to start moving down the track, it's amazing how fast change can commence, and then they start the roadmap and start working through that.
So you don't just work with supermarket, you work with a lot of retailers in a lot of different segments. Are there retailers not in the supermarket grocery segment that are doing a better job than most food retailers are in terms of using their data and becoming more customer centric?
I would actually argue no. I would say that grocery's got clearly a long way to go to fulfill its potential. I'll definitely start my comment with that. But I will also say that probably most retailers look to grocery to see, because I think out of all the retail segments, largely it is probably the most advanced in terms of actually thinking about their data. Certainly different retailer types will do different things. So if you're a department store, you're probably investing and thinking about CRM a lot earlier maybe than grocery stores were, because you've got these big ticket sales and things like that. So you could say, yeah, there's things you could learn from that. But I think a lot of these techniques and things that are being done with the data, there's probably more being done, I believe, in grocery. Again, big generalization, but if you're just sort of say segment by segment, I think grocery is actually probably doing things that a lot of the other retail segments are not.
How about outside the US versus inside the US?
Like, it's hard for me to comment truly on that. But what I could certainly say, like maybe if I reframe that to, people that are doing a good job versus people that are doing a bad job, maybe, which is probably, I think, is equally true, whatever market you're in. You see, what are the ones that are doing a good job? They've got senior leadership that's actually asking the questions of the data. It feels like it just about has to start at their level. We're like, the questions that I'm asking my reports are, as a senior leader in the organization, are ones that can only be answered with an intimate understanding of the customer impact of the data. And then therefore that person's reports need to do that and so on. So then this sort of sets this whole mindset that people start to make sure that they can actually answer these questions and that they're not making decisions without those answers. So I think that's one big thing. I think the other, one thing to think about, the other, taking it in a slightly different direction, the exemplar retailer, right, wherever you are in the world for this, is Amazon. And I don't think anyone's ever going to be Amazon in many respects, because you're not going to be Amazon whoever you are. It's an impossibility, but getting as close as you can, as many fronts as you possibly can, is important, because it's clear to everyone, everything they do has got the customer right in the center of it. Unfortunately, they were built with that, as we said at the beginning, retailers have started with the product at the center of everything. I don't believe that's the case for Amazon. I think if it wasn't immediately, very early on, the customer was at the center of everything for Amazon.
Yeah. So if a retailer, so retailers listening to this and says, they're right. We are too focused on categories and the data related to categories as opposed to the data related to customers. So we need to reorient themselves. So what are one or two things they can do, maybe not easily, but is there low-hanging fruit that they could go after, just in terms of making that shift? And maybe in a lot of ways, it's the same data. It's just looking at it through a different perspective, right?
Yeah, I think, like, what's the number one? Again, it may not necessarily be easy, but simple but not necessarily easy is you can't, as many people have said, I can't remember who it's first attributed to, but you can't really influence what you can't measure. So first thing is probably widen out your thinking about what sort of metrics you're looking at measuring, and look at the whole. They've got to be customer centric. Sort of as a little earlier in the discussion we talked about, what's the decomposition? Our sales numbers are actually just the symptoms of a whole lot of these things. Visits, frequency of visits, spend per visit, things like this. Let's get a clear understanding of that, so we've got some benchmark, and then let's start understanding which of these things we can actually impact. So first thing, what is it weekly? Let's understand those numbers, and that applies at a company level down to a company level over a year, down to a department over a weekend. It all applies, and then let's start thinking about which of these levers we can impact. Let's try some things specifically targeted at those levers. So no, we're not just trying to sell more, we're actually trying to change some specific customer behavior. Let's do test and learn. Let's measure that quite quickly and iterate.
It's funny, I had some months ago, I suggested that it might not be a bad idea, because the data is clearly there, that whether you have 1,000 stores in your company or one store in your company, you can easily identify who your top 10 customers are. So if you were John Smith or Mary Jones and you happen to be the CEO of a 1,000-store chain, it seems to me it wouldn't be hard to get on the phone and say, okay, I need the names and email addresses and or phone numbers of our top 10 customers around all over the country. Just want them. Because I'm going to call them all and I'm going to say, hi, I'm so-and-so, and I just want to thank you for being such one of our best customers. Is there anything I can do for you? It would be life-changing. And in some ways, and then you filter that down so that every store manager, again, whether it's a one-store company or if it's 1,000 store, every one of those store managers, they have to figure out who are our top 10 customers, and maybe it's 15, maybe it's 20, whatever. Pick a number, and just pick up the phone and say, hey, I just wanted to thank you for being And it's accessing the data and acting on it in that sort of way, which is not high tech particularly, right? It's a phone call, maybe it's an email, but it's the way of sort of starting, maybe starting the process. Now, I don't know, am I naive? I think that's a good idea.
Well, I think it's a good idea. I think the idea could be extended a lot further. So
Please.
well, so if you've got 1 million customers, if you've got 5 million customers, you've got 20 million customers, calling your top 10 customers is going to be a very nice thing to do. And I think they'll be grateful. I think it's a great idea. No one could take that away from you. But taking it a step further, it would be nice if we could apply that same principle to all 5 million customers.
Right.
And so, quite, again, let's say simple techniques, but or easy to implement techniques, but simple techniques that exist. So, scoring customers, so we actually know exactly where every single customer sits. Imagine maybe a matrix, which is spend per visit on one axis and number of visits on the other axis, and maybe that's 5 by 5. So in the top right corner, we've got these people that they come often and they visit a lot. So what's our job for them? We just got to retain them. We've got to look after them. We've got this other group, maybe down the bottom. They come in bottom right. Let's say if you're following me, they come in not very often, but when they do, they spend a huge amount. So actually, we could be quite generous to give them offers to try to get them into the store. And again, so it's taking that same principle of yours, but to a larger group, but treating them with exactly what they need to hear from us. Then you might have this other group that they come in very often, but they don't spend very much. What's our strategy with them? Well, it should just be to build the basket. But you can imagine actually applying the strategy from one group to any of the other groups is just wasting your money. It's just burning it. But doing it in a targeted manner obviously actually gives you the sort of results that you're looking for. So, I think there's all sorts of potential around your concept there, obviously.
Yeah. Well, listen, that's music to my ears, and I hope the Morning Newsbeat audience, to at least the percentage to which it's relevant, and it's a pretty big percentage, starts to think this way, because I think there's, especially at a time when there's so much competition from the likes of Amazon, and God knows what other, who else will come in with something different, new, disruptive. Understanding those customers and being able to act on that information is. I mean, it's become a cliche, right? Your most important asset is your customer, but it's absolutely true.
Oh, look, I couldn't agree more. It's like everything in any big organization. It's how do you move from the theory to executing on it, and that's always the challenge, isn't it?
Well, Tom, I appreciate you doing this. I know it's early in the morning there, so I appreciate you getting up and talking to Morning Newsbeat. You're in summer down there. We're in winter. I wish we had your weather.
That's right. Our turn's about to come, so don't worry.
Well, and listen, Auckland is one of my favorite places on earth. So hopefully I get a chance to come to visit when all this nonsense ends.
No, you better.
Sounds good. Hey, listen, take care.
No, always a pleasure. Thanks, Kevin.
Oh, and I should say one more time, Tom is with the 11 Ants Analytics Group. You can find them online. I'll even put a link in the text so you can check them out. So take care,
Thanks
everybody.
very much, Kevin. Appreciate it. Cheers. Bye.